It looks like it is about that time. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Rob Howard. I'm a program manager on the SharePoint Developer Experience team at Microsoft. And I am really excited to be with you today to talk about authentication in SharePoint apps. We got a lot of really cool stuff to show. It's a really powerful new infrastructure, and I think once you sort of get your hands dirty and you understand how things work under the cover, you'll see that things are really powerful and flexible, and you can do a lot of new scenarios that you maybe never could have even imagined in the cloud before. The talk is going to kind of go like this. We're going to start off introducing the new notion of an app principal. So in previous versions of SharePoint, we've got notion of a user principal. So we've got a user that can log in with the username and password. They've got a username. They've got permissions. They've got access to different resources in SharePoint. In this version, we're introducing the notion of an app principal. And we're going to take a few minutes at the beginning and kind of walk through a story that actually has nothing to do with SharePoint, just to kind of set the stage for why app principals are important and why it's an important notion to have with this new app model. Then we're going to kind of talk about all the different ways that apps can authenticate to SharePoint, depending on whether they're SharePoint hosted or provider hosted or auto hosted. Hopefully by now you've got some exposure to all those different terms. We'll talk about how each one of those things can authenticate to SharePoint. And then along the way we'll do a bunch of demos. We'll start off with a really kind of overview demo of a finished app that shows you the kind of things that are possible with the new app model and this new authentication framework. And then we'll do a bunch of apps that are sort of from scratch, where we'll start a new project in Visual Studio, and I'll show you how to do some cool stuff from scratch. The last thing that we'll do is show you how to do some kind of more advanced scenarios with app authentication, things like creating timer jobs that run from outside the farm and acting on behalf of a user days after the last time they logged in, cool stuff like that. So that's how the talk's going to go. It'll be a jam-packed talk, so I will go pretty quickly. But I'm happy to answer questions sort of at the end of the talk as well, and whatever time we have left over in the 75 minutes too. So, all right, so let's start with this notion of app principals. So why do we care about an app principal? Well, I'm going to tell this story. Like I said, it has absolutely nothing to do with SharePoint. The story is about me. So I've got Rob, just as the quick label there. I have gotten a lot of feedback. I've told this story a few times. People said, that doesn't really look like you. So I added a beard. So now it looks just like me. I use a really awesome service that everybody should use called SkyDrive. I put all of my photos in SkyDrive. I have an awesome Windows phone that automatically uploads all my photos to SkyDrive and puts them in albums. So I have thousands of photos up in SkyDrive. And SkyDrive gives me a username and password that I log into that service with to prove that I own those resources. So I have a username and password. I say, hey, I'm Rob Howard. Here's my email address. Here's my password. And SkyDrive says, okay, these are the albums that are Rob's, and Rob has these rights on these albums based on the username and password I give it, these keys. I also use a second service, and this is an imaginary service, but I'm sure everybody here can imagine a bunch of real-life ones that do this. This is Contoso Photo. And Contoso Photo is a cool service where I can upload a bunch of photo albums and order some prints to be printed physically and sent to me in the mail. Contoso Photo has all of my photos that I uploaded. It's got my credit card information. It's got my home address. It keeps track of my orders. So it also gives me a username and password. It has a different way for me to prove that I can get this access to Contoso. And there's a natural question here. I've got a service where I hold all my photos. I've got a service that prints photos. So the next natural question is, hey, can I actually just connect these two things directly? Would it be possible for me to take photos that are in SkyDrive and not have to download them and upload them in a new place, but just say, hey, Contoso Photo, go get the photos that are in my SkyDrive and go ahead and print them directly from there. So how would I actually accomplish this? How would I get Contoso Photo to connect to SkyDrive? Well, the kind of most naive implementation in a bunch of services on the internet actually work this way, scarily enough, is that I just say, hey, I have a username and password to SkyDrive that proves that I get access to these resources. I'm going to give that username and password to Contoso Photo so they can access my SkyDrive as well. And it'll work. I mean, physically, it will actually achieve the scenario, right? Because I, as Rob, have permission to view the photos that are in SkyDrive. And now SkyDrive can't tell the difference between me and Contoso Photo because we both have the same way of proving who we are. So Contoso Photo can also view those photos. But I can do a bunch of other stuff. I can upload photos, I can tag photos, I can comment photos. And maybe I say Contoso is an extremely trustworthy company. They wouldn't want to risk their reputation by posting weird photos into my account or tagging my friends' photos in weird ways. But I can do even scarier stuff, like I can change my own password. And now Contoso Photo can also change my password. And that's scary, right? Like if I change my password, that's my password. I won't be able to log in anymore. And what's worse is that if I decide at some point I don't really want Contoso Photo to have access to my SkyDrive anymore, what do I do? Well, really the only option is I can change my username and password and then start using that new one. And maybe you could say that's kind of an acceptable way to handle it, but what if I have 10 different services that are connected to SkyDrive? So now I have to go to all other 9 services and change, update with a new password because I still want them to get access. So because of the fact that SkyDrive can't tell the difference between me and Contoso Photo in this scenario, I have those problems. I can't revoke Contoso's permission to my stuff. I can't give Contoso less permission than I have to my stuff. SkyDrive can't make any decision based on the fact that it's Contoso accessing SharePoint or accessing SkyDrive instead of me. So there is a better way to implement this, and I'll give you kind of a metaphor that I'll go back to over and over again throughout the talk, which is to say that I actually hand Contoso Photo a note. I give it to them, so I know Contoso Photo has it, and it's a note that's only for Contoso Photo to use. And this note is signed by me. It's got me on it, so that when Contoso Photo shows this note to SkyDrive, they know it's me. And I have the beard there too, so we're good. And this note says exactly what Contoso Photo is allowed to do with my photos. So it says Contoso Photo can just view the photos that are in SkyDrive on behalf of Rob. And I can even do cooler stuff, like I can put an expiry on that note. I can say, hey SkyDrive, this note expires at midnight, so that yeah, Contoso can get access to my stuff in order to print those, but then that access expires, and if Contoso presents that note again, SkyDrive is going to say, well, this is an old note, you got to go get a new one. So this in general is kind of the metaphor that we'll use for how services can connect to one another in a secure way without me having to give my credentials directly to them. And it relies on the fact that SkyDrive, the service that has the resource, can tell the difference between me, the guy with the keys, and somebody who I've given a note to. Can tell the difference between Rob and Contoso Photo. So this is really the notion of that app principle. Contoso Photo here is that app principle that SkyDrive can tell the difference between me and Contoso. So that has nothing to do with SharePoint, right? Obviously, I'm going to tie it in just a second. I'll talk about the life cycle of the SharePoint app model and hopefully explain to you exactly how this applies with our new app model. You may have seen this slide before, so I'll kind of go through it quickly. SharePoint's development model has evolved quite a bit over the last few releases. If you think back to SharePoint 2007, the way that you extended SharePoint was you basically wrote custom server code that ran inside of SharePoint. That little circular black thing is intended to be custom server code. It runs inside of SharePoint. It even runs in the same process that all the SharePoint stuff's running into. So if your code has a bug, or if it uses a lot of resource, or if it does something like make a long blocking off-box call, then the entire SharePoint box is slow. Everybody else who's using that SharePoint box for anything else is experiencing that same bug. And worse, if you crash the process, well then the entire SharePoint farm is crashed. And especially in a multi-tenant environment, this is no good because all the tenants are using that same process. So when you crash one tenant, you're crashing everybody else. In 2010, we did a bunch of investment in something called the sandbox. So we created this safe place on the server where we could run your custom code inside of that safe place. And we would restrict it to only do stuff that we thought was safe. We would isolate it so that it didn't run in the same process, so that if it crashed, it couldn't crash the SharePoint process, all that good stuff. But the key word that I use there is that it's very restricted. You're in this sandbox. So we're making sure it's safe, and that means you can't do a lot of stuff that's really useful, like make off-box network calls and use reflection and name your favorite feature of .NET or just programming in general, and chances are it's something that will either limit or disallow in the sandbox. So in 2013, we went a very different direction, and we created this new app model, where we really optimized for you being able to run your custom code on whatever server platform you want. And that's that box in the upper right-hand corner. So whether that's Windows Azure or it's an IIS it's IIS on a box that you host yourself, or God forbid, maybe you're using LAMP and running on a Linux box. I hope not, but it works. You can make that choice and run that code in that environment where you're totally unrestricted. That environment is not a SharePoint box, right? So there's no restrictions that we're putting on it. You can run whatever code you want. And we really did a lot of work then to optimize the channels between your code, whether it's running on the client in the form of JavaScript or native phone applications, and the server, whether it's running on Windows or it's running on LAMP or it's running in Azure or wherever. And so we did a lot of work in order to enable this authentication channel, the piece between Azure and IIS and our SharePoint API, and make that a very highly capable channel with our authentication and the APIs that we offer this release. So if you think back to the picture that I had before, and you have SkyDrive on the right side of that picture, and SkyDrive has some cool resources like photos, and you've got Contoso Photo that wants to get access to those resources, this same dynamic is at work in this picture here. SharePoint's got a lot of cool resources. We've got documents, we've got user profiles, we've got search, we've got taxonomy, we've got all the kind of things that people use SharePoint for today. And those are available as resources inside of SharePoint. And your custom code is running in a different service. It's like Contoso Photo. It wants to get access on behalf of the users of SharePoint to those resources. So that's how these two things tie in. And again, I'll go back and I'll go back to this metaphor of the Note and Contoso and SkyDrive quite a bit over the rest of the talk. So please keep that in mind as we go. So I'm going to switch and do a quick demo right now. This demo is it's kind of a finished demo. We're not really going to go into too much detail on the code, but it's really kind of an expression of some of the cool things that are possible with this new app model and our new authentication framework. So I'm going to switch over to this monitor. And I asked earlier about size, but I didn't quite get a resounding response, so we'll get a little bigger here. Can people see that okay? Okay. All right, so this demo has to do with our newsfeed infrastructure, with our social infrastructure in SharePoint 2013. I'm sure all of you guys saw this in the keynote when Jeff showed it, or in a subsequent talk, so I won't go into too much detail here. But we've got this awesome social infrastructure in SharePoint. Obviously, I can do all the kind of stuff like you post feeds, @mention people. I can put links up there. I can follow people. But it's also integrated with a bunch of functionality in SharePoint. So I can follow sites. I can follow documents. And those things, when the documents get updated, when the sites get updated, they all push data into the feed. And it's kind of this alive central infrastructure of all the stuff and people and documents that I care about in SharePoint shows up in the feed. Well, applications can take advantage of this too. We have APIs for pushing stuff into the feed. And your application can participate in the same way that all those other things do when you have users of your application. So I have a cool application that is basically about taking an arbitrary link, taking an arbitrary web page, and posting that link to my feed. Well, there's kind of a rub here, which is that I'm running this application on actually this local machine. It's on this laptop that's right here. It's in IIS Express. It's not running on a SharePoint machine. This tenant is in Office 365. So I've got my two different services. I've got my local machine that's Contoso. And I'm trying to get to the feed in Office 365 to post something. But because I'm running on my own machine, I can do really cool stuff. Like, for example, this application has something inside of it called Thumbnail Helper. That's going to take the comment that I have and the title of the page that I have and the link that I have. It's actually going to spin up a web browser on this machine, go out and get a screenshot of the page that I'm trying to share, save that down as a BMP, and actually then post that whole thing to the feed. So if you can think, like, actually running a web browser within a SharePoint process would have been crazy. Obviously, it's totally out of the possibility with the sandbox process. You're not going to run it in the browser. So this is really a situation where I have something that I couldn't really do in a previous model. All right, so I'm just going to go and start this application. There's already an app package installed on my server, so really all it's doing right now is re-registering that app package, and it's starting IIS Express, because this is running locally. It's then going to launch that application to the start page. And the start page of this application is just a page that kind of explains how to use it. It says, oh, there are kind of two different ways to do it. I can create an embed code to embed a link in my site so people can share it. Or I can just use this O365 Connect link. And when I click the link, it just opens a little comment box for me to type a comment, and I can hit post. And since this thing is running on IIS Express, I can actually debug locally, right? This is just the regular ASP.NET web application. I just hit a breakpoint. I can see that the link title is there. The page is called Office 365 Connect. That's the href that I'm trying to share with people. That's the comment, my comment here. So I can debug through that. I can even go and look in the feed helper, and I can see all the code. This is the stuff that's going to actually post that image to my feed. I'll just hit continue. That thing's then going to post this link to my feed. And then I can do other cool stuff, like I can use this like a bookmarklet. So I can add to favorites my O365 Connect link. And then if I were on Engadget and I was like, hey, cool, they have a story about the new cloud app model. I want to share that with my team. I can click the O365 Connect link and say, hey, check this out. Didn't clear that breakpoint, so I'll hit that again. Get rid of that. Or if you came to Vegas and you had never bet on a sports game before and you're a huge 49ers fan, and they ended in a tie. What was that? You might want to post and say, seriously? A tie? I didn't even know that. I honestly didn't know that you could tie in an NFL game. So I'm going to then go back to my news feed after this post here real quick. And you can see that if I mouse over this and I get rid of my JavaScript debugger, it's now got a few new messages in my feed. And you can see that the link that I shared is there. I've got my comment, hey, check this out. I've got the link that I can click. I've got the screenshot of the page that I was on that was created from this web browser control. I've got both of those things there. And the last thing I want to point out is this code is running on IIS Express. It's not running as me. It doesn't have any credentials to SharePoint. But somehow we know that it knows that it's acting on my behalf, right? Because it's posting to my feed. I didn't say post to Rob's feed. I just authenticated through OAuth. We'll see that in a minute. So it knows that it's Rob's feed. It also knows that this is an app called SharePoint Connect. You can see that down here where it says posted a few seconds ago via SharePoint Connect. So it's actually aware of both the fact that it's acting on behalf of me, because I'm using the app, and it's a SharePoint app called SharePoint Connect. It knows both those identities. All right. So hopefully that gave you a kind of quick taste of the kind of stuff you can do. It gave you an idea that SharePoint has this new concept of an app principal that's kind of shining through, and it allows a new kind of development model where I can have these separate services that call into SharePoint and act on users' behalfs. Now we're going to kind of go into the details about how all that works. Before I do that, I want to kind of level set, just some terminology. I'm sure most of you guys already know this. But in terms of access control, when we talk about access control, there are really two different parts. There's one called authentication and one called authorization. And authentication you can kind of think of as figuring out who's making the call. So it's all about proving my identity when I make the call to the caller. It's all about saying it's SharePoint Connect making the call on behalf of Rob. Right? Or it's just Rob making the call. That's authentication. Authorization is that based on who's making the call, are they allowed to do the thing that they're trying to do? Do they have the right permissions? Do they have the right access to that resource? Right? So those are the two different aspects of access control. And we're going to start with authentication. We'll actually talk a little bit about authorization because that's kind of interesting too. But we're going to start with authentication, and we're going to kind of go through the three ways that authentication works in SharePoint apps. And the first is for SharePoint hosted apps. How many people actually understand what SharePoint hosted apps have been in a session about that already? All right, so we've got about half people. So I'll do a quick overview, which is to say that SharePoint hosted apps are basically just pages and declarative elements inside of SharePoint, like lists and libraries. And when you deploy those to SharePoint, they get deployed inside what's called an app web. This is kind of an isolated place that the end user doesn't see, but it's a place where we put all of the code having to do with your app and all the declarative stuff having to do with your app, all the JavaScript. And that app web has a different domain than the rest of SharePoint, so that when that code runs in the browser, it's always going to call back to the same domain. And when code is inside of that app web, that JavaScript or whatever other code that's running inside that app web automatically gets authenticated. There's really nothing that you have to do. That code that came from the app web and is running in the browser will automatically get the identity of the app, and we'll see that in just a second. So basically, the story is when you have a SharePoint hosted app, the app part of the authentication is automatically handled for you. Okay? There's one other thing that's actually really similar to the SharePoint hosted case, and that is that you can actually define a remote server where you want to host your JavaScript, and you can actually declare that in your app and say that this particular URL is part of my app. So that thing can use a cross-domain library that we have to call into SharePoint. And when you do that, app authentication is, again, automatically handled for you. We'll see a demo in just a minute of this app web thing, so maybe it'll be a little bit more clear then. But in both of these cases, you'll see that the call is actually being made from the browser to the app web, right? It's not actually being made from this remote server here on the bottom left. And there are a lot of reasons, and we'll talk about some of those scenarios in a minute, why it's much more powerful to be able to call from that remote server, from that provider-hosted or auto-hosted server. And in that case, we're going to use OAuth to do that call. We're going to use OAuth 2 in particular. And OAuth 2 allows us to, from that server, make a call to any of these SharePoint sites that this app has access to and interact directly with those APIs, whether that's creating list items or posting to feeds or anything like that. So OAuth is the way that we make calls from the server side. I have a quick kind of summary here then about how SharePoint authentication works. This is the flow chart for all the different ways that you can authenticate in SharePoint. The thing that I want you to take away from this slide, there's a bunch of different things kind of happening in this slide. I want you to take away the 4 different kind of outcomes that you can have in this flow chart. So that's really the thing to think about, is the 4 different outcomes, because we're going to talk about those for a while. So when the call comes in and we start off, the first thing we check for is, did the user provide credentials? So what does this mean? Well, if I go to the SharePoint site and I'm in the browser and I'm browsing directly to it, and at some point type in my username and password or use my Windows credentials, that's when a user is providing credentials directly through the browser. You can think of that to go back to that first diagram. When I gave keys to SkyDrive, that's the user credentials, those keys, directly to SkyDrive, not through some other service. Okay? So we first check to say, are there any user credentials on that call? And if there are user credentials on the call, we check to see if the call is part of an app web. Is it part of a SharePoint hosted web? Is it part of a SharePoint hosted app? Excuse me. And if it's not part of a SharePoint hosted app, this is just the same way that SharePoint authentication has always worked. In SharePoint 2010, in SharePoint 2013, and we're still talking about the same way to authenticate end users. We're not doing anything different here. And all we do is we say, and this is one of these outcomes, all we do is we say, we're going to set the current user, the authenticated user, as the context of the current call. So we have just a user on that context. And then we continue to the end and we go along with whatever else is happening on the call. The other possibility is, if that call is part of an app web, then we set 2 different identities on that call. We set the app's identity and the user's identity. We say the app is acting on behalf of the user. Right? All right, so then let's talk about what happens if there are no user credentials provided. Then we're going to look for what we call an app token or an access token. And you can think of that access token as being very similar to the note that I was talking about before. So this is the scenario when I have a remote service. I've got some other service that's calling into SharePoint. It's not a user directly. It's some other user acting on behalf. It's some other service acting on behalf of that user. And that's what that app token or access token is. If there's not one of those things, well, then we don't have any form of authentication. We're just going to treat it as an anonymous request, right? Now, if we have a public-facing website, that might work. Usually, you'll get access denied, and we'll just go on the end. So now we have 3 different outcomes, right? We have a user only, we have a user and an app, and we have nobody. We have anonymous, right? All right, so then let's go back to what happens when there is an app token. That's a really interesting case. So when there is a note on there, there are actually 2 different kinds of notes. There's one that I talked about first, where that app has a user on it. It's signed by a user. Remember, it's got me with a little beard on it, and it shows up at SkyDrive. And so SkyDrive says, oh, this is the app acting on behalf of Rob. So that means the app includes a user. The app token includes a user. And in that case, when it does include a user, we're going to end up in that same app end user case, the app acting on behalf of a user. There's one other kind of note, which is one that an app kind of writes for itself. It doesn't have any user on it. It's not acting on behalf of a user. It's just an app. It's making what we call an app-only call. And this enables a lot of really cool scenarios that we'll talk about more when we get to authorization. But you can almost think of this as like a privilege elevation or a run with elevated privileges block from a remote service. We'll talk in more detail about that in just a minute. So in that case, when there's no user on that app token, we end up with just an app. Right? And that's the fourth outcome. So we've got just a user and an app, just an app, and nothing. That make sense? I see at least a couple heads nodding, so we're good so far. All right, what do we got next? Okay, so now we're actually going to do some basic app authentication demos. And I promised a bunch of my demos would be kind of from scratch demos. So we're actually going to do a lot of File New Project in Visual Studio. The first one I'm going to show you, though, is actually the most simple SharePoint hosted app. So this is a SharePoint hosted app that is literally just one custom list. I'm actually going to go launch it so you can see it. If I go to Site Contents, this is a basic SharePoint hosted app. It is the most basic SharePoint hosted app. This SharePoint hosted app in particular just has a custom list. And the only field in this custom list is a title. And that's all that's in here. Right? So it's a very trivial, totally uninteresting app. But there's one thing that I want to point out here. So we talked about, for example, the fact that this is going to be hosted from an isolated domain. And you can see that up there. So that -C39D2EB thing is specific for that app. So whenever a call comes in that has that user authentication on it, and it's to that domain, we say that's part of the app web. So remember, we end up with app and user in that case. Right? So whenever a call happens there, that's what we're going to end up with. So what will happen then is if I just go to this list and I click New Item, and I say test item, this is actually happening as this app, this basic SharePoint hosted app, on behalf of Rob Howard. That's the authentication context of this call. So when I hit save, if I go back and look at this list item, you can actually see it says created at this time by basic SharePoint hosted app on behalf of Rob Howard. So SharePoint actually knows that it was created by this app on behalf of Rob. And that's in the version history, that's in your modified by field, and so there's actually an app modified by field and a user modified by field now. So you can do all of that sort of filtering that you would expect based on both of those entities. Remember, this is just a super simple SharePoint hosted app, so I didn't do anything other than just add a list to it, and that's how this behaves out of the box. Okay? So now let's do something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go to Visual Studio, and I'm going to create a provider hosted app. So this is an app that's going to run remotely on a server that I am in charge of. So I'm going to say, we're going to call it Basic Provider Hosted App. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to debug on that same site. I'm going to choose Provider Hosted here. Actually, when you're developing auto-hosted and provider hosted work pretty much the same. It's just when you finally deploy. And I'm going to hit Finish. And for those of you who haven't seen the Visual Studio tools in this case before, what it's going to do is create a new solution for me. One of the projects in the solution is going to be for that SharePoint app. So if I go to Solution Explorer, you'll see here's the SharePoint hosted app part. And then this is just the regular ASP.NET web application. So it's just, like any other ASP.NET web application, I can use all the same features. It's a little bit configured. It's got the right references to our client libraries and stuff like that. But other than that, it's the same as any other sort of ASP.NET web application. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go in and add that same list. So I'm going to add the custom list, the really uninteresting custom list with just the title. And I'm just going to choose custom list and make it non-customizable just to be as bland as humanly possible. And then I'm actually going to go into the start page, the provider-hosted start page inside this ASP.NET web application. Let's hope that the network continues to cooperate. Perfect. OK, so I'm going to go into the start page of this provider-hosted ASP.NET web application. And this is just an ASP.NET web forms page. And Visual Studio has actually dumped in some starting code that actually already configures and uses OAuth. And it's going to call back into SharePoint with our managed client object model to just get the web title. That's what that code does. If I just hit F5, it would get that web title. It's not very interesting, so I want to show you a little bit more than that, but it's still relatively basic. I am going to first insert a snippet that's going to read and validate what we call the context token. And the context token is a little token that we send the app every time we launch it, that remote app. So we say, hey, it's almost the first step of handing that note. It says, here's a note, so when you want to call back into SharePoint, here's where you call, here's how you call back in order to act on behalf of that user. And that's what that context token is. And the context token is signed with that app secret, so the app can actually validate it and say, yeah, this is actually a real SharePoint server that's really trying to launch my app. So it can do that. That's what that read and validate part is. This read and validate, wrong mouse. This read and validate context token. And then I get this SharePoint context token typed object out of it. And that's what I'm going to use to actually make a request inside of SharePoint. So the next piece I'm going to do is just insert a little utility function that creates list items. All this is going to do is use our managed client object model to get the custom list that's in my app web. It's then going to create a new item in that list. It's going to set the title to be a parameter of this function. And then it's going to update it and execute that query. One of the arguments that it takes here is an access token. That access token is the app token from that flowchart. Remember we said, do we have user credentials? Yes, no. If there are no user credentials, we say, do we have an app token? Do we have an access token? That's what this access token is. So there's actually a really simple library that's provided with all Visual Studio projects by default called Token Helper that helps us get that with one call. So you can see here, I'm going to create a new app and user access token by calling tokenhelper.getAccessToken and passing in that context token. And Token Helper is then going to take care of doing all the transactions in order to get the access token. And I can actually go and look at the source code of this. It's just a source file that's included with Visual Studio if I'm really interested in exactly the entire transaction. But what I end up with is this app and user access token. And then I'm just going to call create list item with this app and user access token and call it item created with app and user. And then the last thing I'm going to do is insert a snippet to create an app-only list item. So this is going to use Token Helper to get an app-only access token. This is that note that doesn't have a user on it. So this is going to be an app-only call. And it's going to call create list item with that same app-only access token, but it's going to say item created with app-only. And then the last thing that it's going to do is it's going to, oh, and I actually just messed up one thing. It's actually going to write to the page a link to that custom list, just so I can look at the list items that were created in the previous code. And since I accidentally pressed install without first asking for the right permission, I'm going to switch over to my baked version here. It'll be a little bit faster. I'm just doing the exact same thing. Trust me. All right, so now we're deploying that one. That one was already deployed, so that'll actually be a little bit faster. It's going to communicate with SharePoint. It's going to get that context token. And then the page is going to run. Can actually do that same breakpoint. May have missed it. Can do that same breakpoint. You can see that I'm actually running locally. I can see the app-only access token. It's this really ugly base64 encoded string. If I let it go, it should have created a few of those items by now. I'm going to click the link to the custom list. And you can see those items. There's item created with app and user, item created with app only. If I look inside of them, and ignore the JavaScript error. Sorry. If I look inside of them, you can see that the first one that's created with app and user is, again, basic remote app auth demo test on behalf of Rob Howard. And the item created with app only just says created by basic remote app auth demo test. So again, SharePoint's aware of these two different entities, And this is that second of the two cases where we have app plus user, and in this case we just had app only. All right. So that's the really basic SharePoint auth demo test. I'm going to go back to slides. What you saw there is just a couple of lines of code that are going to take the context token, get an access token, and then just use our managed object model very easily to interact with SharePoint. It turns out that there's a ton of stuff going on behind the scenes. There's a whole bunch of transactions with ACS and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. To do basic scenarios like just run server-side code that makes API calls on behalf of users and things like that, you don't really need to know any of the behind-the-scenes stuff that's happening there. So it's really just as easy as doing file new project, creating those items with the client context that you get from Token Helper, and interacting with it back. But there are some advanced scenarios where you may actually really want to know all the things that are happening under the covers. Or if you're not going to use Token Helper, if you're writing a LAMP-based application, you may want to know all the different transactions that are going on so you can actually handle them. And one thing that I encourage you to do if you're really interested in that sort of depth is to go through Token Helper and look at the source code. It's included with every sort of Visual Studio project, so you can just go through and look at exactly what all those code does. But the other thing I'll do is I'm going to go through a box and line diagram real quick. That's going to show you exactly what happens along the way at every point in that transaction that really was 2 lines in Visual Studio, but what's happening underneath the covers and all the sort of transactions that are enabling this. The way this slide works is the left part has exactly what you're seeing on the screen, what the user is seeing on the screen at each point of the transaction. The top right part has a box and line diagram of the entire thing, so you get to see exactly what requests are being made where. And the bottom right describes exactly what's happening in that particular request. So in this scenario, the user is browsing to a SharePoint page that has an app part inside of it. The transactions will actually look exactly the same whether there's an app part or we're actually browsing to an app page. But in this particular one, we'll say the user is browsing to a SharePoint page, and SharePoint has an app part inside of it. So the first thing is user types that URL in their browser and hits enter. And the browser makes a request to SharePoint to say, hey, I'd like the contents of this page. Now, the SharePoint server notices that there's an app part for a particular app in there, and it says, hey, we're going to need to give that app part a note so it can call back into SharePoint. So it goes to ACS, which is our STS in the cloud. It's the thing that creates all these access tokens and context tokens and refresh tokens and all those things. And we say, hey, ACS, can you give us a signed context token that tells us about the current user and is intended for this particular app in the page? So ACS creates that token and returns it to SharePoint. And then SharePoint renders the entire page, everything except that app part. And what ends up happening is that there's an iframe in that page where the app part is. And that iframe is going to take the context token, you can see it there as a parameter, and it's going to actually post it to, as in the body of the request, it's going to post it to app.com and say, hey, there's a user who's trying to make this request. Here's the start of that note. Here's the context token that's going to allow you to call back into SharePoint. And that's this request here, the one that the browser makes in order to render that iframe. App.com is first going to validate it. It's going to make sure it's signed with its secret so that it knows it was really intended for it. It's not some hacker or some random person just visiting its internet website. And then if it wants to call back into SharePoint, it's going to get an access token from ACS. This is what that token helper.getAccess token call was doing. It goes over to ACS and it says, here's my context token, or here's the refresh token from my context token. Can you give me an access token back? ACS says, yep, you're really the app that you say you are. Here's your token to act on behalf of the user who's logged in the browser. And then app.com makes a call to SharePoint. And it can call whichever flavor of API it wants. It can call _API on the REST side. It can use our managed client object model. And it can make that call using that access token to get information from SharePoint server. That information is then returned to app.com. And then app.com can render whatever it wants inside of its portion of the page, maybe based on that SharePoint data. Now, this looks especially complex. It looks like there's a ton of different requests going on here. When you actually saw the code, though, there were really 2 lines of code that handled this whole thing from the app's perspective. So it's actually very simple in the sort of base case. And the other thing that I'll say is that on most requests, most of these lines don't actually happen. So lines 2 and 3 will cache. So we won't go to ACS every time to get a new context token. We'll cache that for a while. And then most apps will probably cache the access tokens they get from ACS. So lines 6 and 7 don't usually happen on every request. So it's actually, in a typical request, it's actually many fewer lines than this. The one other thing that I want to show is this is actually what that context token looks like. This is a real context token. This is shown in the body of the request. So when we posted a request to app.com and said, hey, can you load this app? This thing went along in the body of the request. And it's a big, really ugly string. What it actually is it's a JWT token, JWT. JWT stands for JSON Web Token. JWT is one of those weird standards that actually in the standard it says how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's not JWT, it's JOT. And the way you read this thing is you unencode it, and you end up with a JSON blob. So this is what the thing looks like on the inside. There's a bunch of interesting claims in here. Token-helper.read and validate context token actually goes through all these things and makes sure that all the right claims are used in all the right places. And there's a bunch of documentation about what each one of these claims actually means, if you're really interested. I'm not going to go through it here. We're a little short on time. I am really happy to go through it if anybody wants to talk about it afterwards, and there are a bunch of resources on dev.office.com if you really want to know. The one thing that I will point out is this thing at the bottom, the second to the bottom one, called refresh token. And this is the thing that your app is going to extract from the context token. And again, it's all handled by token helper if you don't actually want to write the code. But it's going to extract it from the context token and send it off to ACS to get a new access token. And this refresh token is actually good for 6 months from the time that you get it. So when your app gets this refresh token, it can do things like cache that refresh token in order to act on behalf of that user for a long period of time afterward. If your app gets revoked or uninstalled or loses access, that won't work. But as long as you're still installed on that site, that refresh token can be used. And we'll see a demo of that a little bit later. All right, so we talked about authentication. We talked about that you can end up with a user, you can end up with an app, you can end up with an app acting on behalf of a user, and you can end up with nothing. But that just tells the first half of that access control story, right? Now we know who's making the call, but we don't know what they have access to. And having both of those different things on the call, an app and a user, makes this a little bit more complex. So we have to think about how that affects what the call can do. So that's what this section is about. I'm going to start with just the logical model, how you should kind of think about this conceptually. So we talked about the app principal. We now know that apps actually have a principal. They have an identity. And it's separate from the user that's acting on behalf of that app. So for example, when we've got the photo printing app, that is a different principal. It's a different identity from the user using the photo printing app. And access is still based on grants. It's still based on the rights I have, the permissions I have to content inside of SharePoint. But now both users and apps can have grants to that content. So for example, the printing app can get read access to a picture library, right? And that's independent of whether the user has access. So the way the access check then works is we take into account all the different identities on that context, and we take into account their permissions. And depending on which identities are on that context, we apply a slightly different policy. So when we have just a user identity, we don't have any app on the call, we just do what we've always done. We said we use the user-only policy, and we say, does the user have access to do the thing they're trying to do? Do they have read access on this particular library? If so, then yes, let the call go through. If there's a user and an app, if it's an app acting on behalf of a user, then we actually require that both the user and the app have access to do the thing that they're trying to do. So if the app doesn't have access, the app hasn't requested permission to say, hey, I want to read pictures in this library, and the user hasn't given them that access, even if the user has permission, that call will get access denied. Or if the app has access, but that user doesn't have access to read content in that library, you'll get access denied. And you have app and user. That brings us to the last one, called app only. And app only is a really powerful way of doing app authentication. What app only does is it says, I as an app am going to make a call. And the user that I'm acting on behalf of right now may not have access to do the thing I'm about to do. So I actually explicitly want to say, I'm just doing this as the app. I'm going to elevate privileges to do something that I can do, but the user might not be able to. So think about, I have an expense reporting app where I wouldn't want to give an end user of that app the ability to approve that app, the expense reports. That would sort of defeat the purpose of having an expense reporting app. So instead what I would do is I would say users don't have permission to approve expense reports, but the app does. And the app normally runs with the app plus user policy, but at that last second when the app says, okay, now whatever condition has been met, somebody approved it or the dollar amount was low enough, and the app has some logic that says, no, now it's okay to approve it, it would make an app-only call with that app-only access token to do the approval. So this is actually a really powerful notion. This is if you're familiar with SharePoint server-side coding, you can have a run with elevated privileges block to say, hey, my code is going to do something that the current user can't do, right? And doing that in the sandbox is totally impossible. Doing that from the client-side object model in the past would be totally crazy to even think about. But now you actually have this capability as an app to essentially do a run with elevated privileges inside this new app model from a remote service. So it's a really powerful capability. All right. So now that the question is, we said apps have to have permission to the resources that they want to interact with. And the next question is, well, how do they get that resource? And the quick summary is that apps request the permission that they need to run. So if I'm an app and I know that I need to read information from a document library, or I know that I need to read a specific picture library, I'll actually claim that. I'll say, I need this in order to run. And I do that by creating some XML, and I put that XML inside of my app. This XML has kind of an interesting structure to it. It's got two attributes on it. It's got a scope attribute and a write for each one of these permission requests. And the scope is the kind of object that it wants access to. So here we have SharePoint/content/site collection. The first part of this is saying which product. So if you're asking for permission to exchange or link or something like that, then it would be a different product. But for now, we're just talking about SharePoint. The second is what kind of component inside SharePoint are you want. So in this case, we have list and library content. But there's also the social components, there's taxonomy, there's search. Those are different components. And then the last is the specific component inside of that. So this thing is asking for access to the site collection. You could also do site collection/web to get access to the web, or /web/list to get access to the list, or content/tenant to get access to the entire tenant. And then the next piece is the write that you want on that resource. So in this case, the app is asking for access to read the content in that site collection. But it could also ask to write to that content or to manage that content. So that's what the structure looks like. These are literal strings. So this isn't like I replace this with a URL, right? I don't know the URL in advance that I'm going to be deployed to. So this is actually what I would type in. I'd say I want access to the site collection where I'm being installed. And then that goes inside of my app manifest. And you can describe then the set of permissions that you need in your app manifest. And when you install that app, when the end user installs that app, we take that XML and we convert it into a consent dialog. We say, do you trust this application to do this set of things? And we describe it to them, and they get to say either they trust it or they don't trust it. It's an all or nothing thing. You're not going to end up in a situation where you only have half the permissions you asked for. The user either trusts you with all the permissions you need to run, or you don't. There was one other thing that I was going to say about this. Give me just a second. Oh, yes. OK. So this format looks a little ugly. I mean, it's not too bad. There's an XSD for it and all that. Visual Studio tools actually have an app manifest designer also. So you can just go in the permissions tab of the app manifest designer, and then you don't have to mess with the XML. And you can just say, I want read access to the web. And it'll generate the XML for you. So while you may want to know about this XML, you don't actually have to. OK. And then this is the scope. This is the set of initial permissions you can request. It's really for you to refer to later. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it's stuff like content. You can request access to connect to BCS entities. You can do queries in search. You can do project server stuff. You can interact with our social infrastructure. You can do taxonomy. So there's a pretty good set of different things that you can ask for access to as an app. All right. Next thing we're going to do is dive down into some advanced authentication scenarios. So these are those things that I was talking about that make the infrastructure really powerful. I'm going to do a really quick demo. It's actually, I call it advanced. It's actually a pretty simple scenario, I think. And in this particular case, what I'm going to show is caching that refresh token. So we talked about that refresh token and the context token. We said I can use that thing for 6 months, right? So I can call even when the user's not in the browser. I can say that I want to run a timer job, and I can say every morning at 2 a.m. I'm going to call into SharePoint on behalf of that user, and I'm going to aggregate all the changes for the day and send them an email or something like that. Or the traditional notion that you would create a timer job for in SharePoint, where you batch up some work and then you do all that stuff on a regular interval. You can do that with these refresh tokens as well. So it's a really kind of powerful notion. And I'm just going to show you really quickly just basically the most minimal case just to prove that it works. And I'm going to go into this same application that we just had, this basic remote app auth demo. And I'm going to get rid of the code that actually created the access token straight away. And I'm just going to use ASP.NET's caching. So this is really kind of a lame look at how to do this. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cache the context token object. I'm just going to use ASP.NET's out-of-the-box caching to cache the context token object and the web URL I want to call. And then I'm going to register a handler that when that cached object expires is going to call back into SharePoint using that access token. And it's going to create a list item based on that. I'll show you that code in just a second. Just going to add the last piece. This is my context cache data class. So this is the actual object that I'm going to cache. You can see that there's that context token, which has the refresh token inside of it. There's the URI where I'm going to call back into SharePoint. I'm caching that object. And this is the code that's actually saying, OK, I'm going to create a new cache callback. I'm going to cache this data, this cache context data, the SharePoint context token in the app web. I'll insert that object into the cache, the ASP.NET cache. I'll give it an expiration of 20 seconds. Actually, 20 seconds is a long time to wait, I've noticed. So I'm going to go down to, let's say, 12. And then I'm going to, when that thing expires, call this callback on remove. And on remove is going to pull that context, pull the cache data out, pull the context token out of that cache data, and create an access token. And then it's going to call create list item with that access token. So I'm going to hit F5. It's going to deploy this thing. What you're actually going to see is that same page that's going to have that create list item link on it. And what happened right now is nothing. That thing didn't actually create a list item, right? It just created an item in the cache. And ASP.NET has that cache. It's keeping track of that time, and it's waiting 12 seconds or however long we put in there. And hopefully here in just a second, those 12 seconds will actually run out. It'll call that callback, use that cache refresh token, and then it should create, if I hit refresh, not quite yet. See, I told you, 12 seconds is a really long time. Should have set a breakpoint. Phew, OK, there we go. Created from onRemove cache handler. So this is the item that was created when that item came out of the cache. So this is a little bit of a lame demo, I will admit. But you can see the principle. So this is actually, I wasn't actually running a browser request when that thing happened, right? I was outside of the app. I was just looking at the list. And this service rehydrated that token, which again lives for 6 months after the last time you got a new token. And it was able to call back into SharePoint. So you can imagine doing the same thing in a Windows service that runs every night at 12 a.m. or something like that. You can imagine doing the same thing in order to interact with the user on a regular basis or interact with the user when an event happens in SharePoint and call back and let them know about that event. So there's a lot of really powerful things you can do once you have this notion of a refresh token that's cached and is long-lived in order to act on behalf of a user. The next scenario that I want to talk about is how app identity works online and on-prem. All the stuff that I showed you is in Office 365. You have an app, you have Office 365, and that ACS component that creates the tokens is part of a component called Azure AD, which is in Office 365. When you get Office 365, you automatically get one of these Azure AD tenants. And so all of this stuff that I showed you kind of just works out of the box with Office 365. There is a different way to do this on-prem. All of the exact same code, all of the exact same stuff that I talked about works. All of the same APIs, all of the same code that I wrote in all those applications work on-prem. But the way that you actually create that note works a little bit differently. The app actually uses its own certificate to create its own note. And Token Helper has all that library inside of it. So it's, again, just using Token Helper to get an access token. So all the code works the same way, except under the covers, that Token Helper is making a decision about whether I have one of these context tokens or whether I'm self-signing my token. So in this case, I can actually take advantage of the app model. I can take advantage of all those same remote deployed applications, all those same capabilities, all those same permissions in an on-prem environment when I don't have Office 365 and Azure AD. And the last case is I can actually, if I have both Office 365 and I have SharePoint on-prem, I can actually connect my on-prem apps or my on-prem SharePoint server to Azure AD in the cloud, the one that I got with Office 365. And then I can connect all the applications that are running in the cloud, applications that are running, say, from the marketplace or ones that I created myself to my on-prem server. Or I can take applications that are running on-prem that I'm running behind a firewall, and I can run them against my Office 365 server. And a single application can make both of those calls when I have this hybrid environment. So this is a little bit more of an advanced scenario. There are some differences. I said that on-premises works a little different because it's cert-based trust. Hybrid actually takes some setup on the part of the IT guy to actually connect Azure AD in the cloud to the stuff on-prem. So if you're interested in this stuff, in particular the hybrid stuff, I have a talk on Thursday morning at 10:15 or so that's all about building hybrid apps. So it's all about the intricacies of building apps that can talk either on-prem or online or both. And we'll do the cert-based stuff, we'll do all that stuff. It'll be very in-depth. We'll go into token formats and all that kind of stuff, so be forewarned. The last thing I want to talk about is basically just to tell you guys that we've actually put our money where our mouth is. So this is an architectural slide of what SharePoint 2013's workflow service looks like. In SharePoint 2010, we actually had a workflow host. That's this classic workflow thing in here that's running inside of SharePoint. And that workflow host actually ran sort of in proc with all the SharePoint stuff the same way Custom Solutions did. And if it had a problem, it caused problems with everything else inside of SharePoint. And it also meant that we were kind of tied to SharePoint's ability to iterate on our workflow host. So one of the really cool things that Workflow did this release is they actually moved to a remote Azure workflow service, to Workflow Manager on the latest bits of workflow, and they can iterate on that workflow piece and run that workflow piece independently. And that entire infrastructure, the connection between SharePoint and that remote Workflow Manager, is all done through this same sort of authentication. They have the exact same way of calling back and forth through SharePoint. The trust is configured in the exact same way. They call the exact same set of APIs. So if there's something that Workflow can do, it's calling the same sort of API that you will. There are even app-only steps inside of Workflow. So you can say, for this step, I actually want to use an app-only call instead of an app plus user call to do that same elevation. So this is really the same infrastructure. And we've actually built a core part of the SharePoint product on top of it. So we feel really confident that this is an enterprise class, an enterprise scale infrastructure that is really ready for enterprise applications to be built on top of it. All right, so that's all I have. I'm going to take questions in just a minute. We've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions. The takeaways that I want you to come away with are, in 2013, when you have an app and a user, we're independently authenticating both of those things. We know both about the app and the user. When we do authorization, it takes into account both of those pieces of information. It knows whether it's an app and a user and what access both of those things have. And then there's a bunch of advanced scenarios that you can get to by using stuff like app-only calls to do privilege elevation, or using refresh tokens to call on behalf of a user on a regular basis through timer jobs or through cached infrastructure. That allows you to create applications that have the kind of capabilities that you really have no chance of creating in the sandbox, for sure, and that are even very difficult to implement in full trust if you're only targeting on-prem. So this is a really powerful infrastructure. All right, please, please, please fill out evaluations. Help me figure out what I did wrong, what I can do better next time, so I know how to make the talk even better. Let us know how the conference is going. And thank you very much. I'll take a few questions.